In the first 100 days of Donald Trump's second term, his administration launched an extraordinary assault on environmental protections, executing 145 deregulatory actions, more than one per day. This sweeping offensive targeted everything: clean air, endangered species, wetlands, and climate change. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin even declared they were driving a dagger straight into the heart of the climate change religion. This is not just policy, it's an ideological crusade. Yet where are the protesters? While Trump's immigration raids and authoritarian overreach spurred mass demonstrations involving millions, the environmental movement has remained conspicuously silent. This is deeply alarming. When ecological destruction threatens society's very foundations, the absence of robust environmental response reveals a troubling failure of democratic resistance. The contrast is stark. The Women's March and immigration protests mobilized millions, transforming outrage into mass action. Environmental protests, however, remain scattered and insufficient. Earth Day 2025 drew only hundreds of thousands, a sobering decline from the 20 million Americans who marched in 1970, sparking the EPA's creation. Today, the movement struggles to fill a city park. Why does environmental destruction, arguably the most urgent threat, fail to inspire the same scale of resistance? The answer lies not in apathy, but in the fractured state of the environmental movement, the psychological distance of abstract dangers, and the quiet spread of climate fatalism, a belief that change is no longer possible. The unprecedented scale of environmental destruction. Trump's second term accelerated environmental destruction to breathtaking levels: 145 rollbacks in just 100 days, more than his entire first presidency. This blitzkrieg targeted virtually every major environmental protection. Biden-era green policies were deleted, climate spending frozen, and the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Accords again. Land, including in the Arctic, was opened for drilling. Ocean sanctuaries permitted commercial fishing. Half of national forests can now be logged. Endangered species protections faced drastic rollbacks. Yet this carnage generated no mass resistance proportionate to its consequences. Why? We must examine the deeper structural and psychological factors. The fragmentation trap, losing a unified voice. The most fundamental barrier is the fragmentation trap, the movement's evolution from a unified force into hundreds of disconnected, issue-specific organizations. As one analyst put it, they are so disconnected that they are barely recognizable as a movement. This disunity, partly due to the vast spectrum of concerns, stems more critically from a lack of diverse organizational models that discourages strategic collaboration. For the average citizen, the movement presents a dizzying array of narrowly focused organizations working in silos. Many are disoriented by the absence of a unified approach. Even committed individuals find themselves dispersed with limited collective voice. This fragmentation hampers mass protest. Unlike immigration rights, which coalesce around clear demands like stop family separations, the environmental movement lacks unified messaging or coordinated strategy. When Trump announced his 31 environmental rollbacks, no central organization convened a unified response. Dozens of groups issued separate press releases, ensuring the response, however earnest, would be diffuse and diluted. This contrasts sharply with other movements. The Women's March forged a unified framework. No King's protests united a broad coalition. Immigration rights mobilizes effectively around immediate, visceral injustices. The environmental movement remains mired in silos, unable to organize at scale. Citizens find themselves adrift, unsure how to act, and disheartened by the movement's failure to offer a forceful reply. The result is paralysis. The psychology of distant threats, no immediate urgency. Beyond fragmentation lies the psychological distance from environmental harm. Unlike immigration raids, which produce immediate suffering, environmental deregulation unfolds through delayed, diffuse, and statistical mechanisms that make its impact less tangible and urgent. Temporal distance dulls immediacy. Threats unfolding over years struggle to compete with real-time crises. When rollbacks lead to thousands of additional deaths from poor air quality each year, the danger is indefinite. Spatial distance compounds this. Harms often occur in remote areas or are invisible in cities. Most critically, statistical distance hinders emotional engagement with harms conveyed through numbers, not human stories. Thousands of additional deaths is factual but emotionally inert, lacking the moral gravity of watching children separated from parents. This emotional disconnect is further compounded by the complexity of environmental systems. Citizens can't easily trace the arc from dismantled methane standards to global warming. The human stakes remain obscured, and the public struggles to respond with urgency. Other Trump-era policies possess an immediacy that galvanizes outrage. ICE raids are tangible. Expanded executive power has clear constitutional ramifications. Military parades offer unmistakable authoritarian symbolism. Environmental threats, however grave, rarely evoke the same visceral urgency. Their mechanisms are complex, effects delayed, and victims dispersed or anonymous. This is not public apathy, but a profound psychological challenge, mobilizing collective action around threats that bypass our wiring for immediate, visible danger. The fatalism factor, paralysis from despair. Perhaps the most insidious obstacle is the rising tide of climate fatalism, the conviction that ecological collapse is inevitable and action cannot alter its course. This resignation, spreading acutely among young people, contrasts sharply with the hope-fueled activism that once defined environmental advocacy. Many today retreat under despair. Research shows young people are significantly more likely to express fatalism about reducing emissions. This ecological fatalism is a bleak fusion of anxious anticipation and hopeless resignation. Though most young people worry about climate change, this concern often coexists with anger, grief, and paralysis, not hopeful engagement. When individuals believe the outcome is preordained, they are far less likely to take risks for resistance. Why march if the battle is lost? Fatalism becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This contrasts sharply with hope-driven narratives that fueled successful social movements. The civil rights and women's suffrage movements instilled belief that justice was achievable. The environmental movement has increasingly leaned into a lexicon of despair. Its rhetoric, however scientifically grounded, often veers into apocalyptic messaging that emphasizes enormity while offering few credible routes to resolution. Terms like climate emergency can paradoxically silence rather than stir. This sense of doom is magnified by digital architectures that amplify negative headlines, fostering apocalypse fatigue and psychological numbing. Activists increasingly speak from a framework of inevitable loss. Our language revolves around managed decline and adaptation, terms that reflect sober scientific understanding but offer little transformative vision. While intellectually honest, this inadvertently stifles the energy needed for mass mobilization. The result is a movement immobilized by its own insight. The burnout crisis and specialization trap. The environmental movement struggles are also deeply cultural. Unlike other movements that cultivate supportive ecosystems, environmental activist spaces are marked by burnout, tokenism, and marginalization. Despair over climate change leads to exhaustion, seemingly inevitable for activists facing endless defeats. This creates learned helplessness, the belief that one's actions cannot meaningfully influence outcomes. The movement culture is often defined by apocalypse fatigue and climate grief rather than energizing hope. Furthermore, the formidable technical complexity of environmental issues leads to a specialization trap. Organizations focus on narrowly defined, technically dense issues. While essential for policy work, this erects barriers to public engagement. The more expert the movement becomes, the more inaccessible it often is to the public it seeks to mobilize. Environmental messaging speaks to policy experts, not ordinary citizens. Contrast this with other movements that translate complex policy into simple, moral frameworks. Environmental advocates often feel obligated to communicate scientific nuances, even if it dilutes urgency. This commitment to accuracy, while reflecting integrity, produces rhetoric ill-suited to mass mobilization, sacrificing moral clarity for scientific caution. The institutional capture problem, losing grassroots power. The movement's crisis is deeply entangled with institutional capture, the gradual transformation of grassroots activism into professionalized advocacy organizations prioritizing insider influence over mass engagement. Today's environmental landscape is dominated by advocacy organizations, staffed by professionals and funded by grants and major donors, not broad-based membership. This model brings stability, but at a profound cost. Organizations become more attuned to elite stakeholders than everyday citizens. They traded the disruptive energy of the street for cautious diplomacy, losing their vital founding spirit. These professional organizations prioritize insider strategies, lobbying, lawsuits, navigating regulations. Success is measured by policy wins, not public mobilization. Protests often become performative spectacles for press coverage. This contrasts starkly with membership-based civil rights and labor movements, or grassroots movements like Black Lives Matter. The environmental movement largely forsook its membership roots, losing its capacity for high-risk, high-commitment collective action. Bereft of authentic, community-anchored power, its ability to disrupt is damaged. This shift also means institutions prioritize their own survival. Reliance on grants and policymakers makes them risk-averse, incremental, and less willing to embrace bold rhetoric. The ecological crisis's urgency is softened into polite advocacy. They operate within existing systems, championing market-based solutions that pose no real threat to corporate power. Their growing dependence on foundation funding subtly reshaped priorities, favoring narrow projects over expansive grassroots organizing. The very funding intended to support the movement has, in many cases, pacified it, diverting its radical edge. Compounding this is corporate capture. Major environmental organizations accept fossil fuel funding, entering partnerships that blunt their capacity to speak truth to power. In pursuing access and financial stability, the movement often sacrificed its moral compass, becoming complicit in its own irrelevance. The path forward: rebuilding environmental resistance. The environmental movement's mobilization crisis is not a foregone conclusion. The movement that once brought 20 million Americans into the streets still holds the latent power to galvanize mass resistance. But it requires a profound reimagining. First, the movement must confront its organizational fragmentation. While specialization is necessary, it must be counterbalanced by unified structures capable of coordinating large-scale collective action. A strategic federation umbrella is needed to align messaging, synchronize tactics, and speak with one voice. This coordination must also embrace a broader, more inclusive coalition, bringing in environmental justice communities, labor unions, and faith-based groups. Second, the movement must transform how it communicates. Advocates must speak as moral leaders, recasting environmental destruction as a profound ethical crisis, demanding action from everyone. Grounding the struggle in lived experience and moral clarity can reclaim emotional power. Third, the movement must reclaim the language of hope. To inspire mass mobilization, it must cultivate narratives affirming collective action and convincing people their efforts can shape change. This means lifting up stories of victories and successful resistance, showing clear links between protest and impact. Amid the crisis, the movement must communicate not just what's at stake, but what remains possible. This is a call for strategic storytelling that acknowledges danger without despair, insisting that challenges, though immense, are not immutable. The movement must help people believe again. The future is not yet written, their voices matter, and the arc of ecological history can be bent toward justice. Fourth, the environmental movement must reckon with its internal culture, building inclusive spaces that sustain activists. This means centering frontline communities' leadership, cultivating mutual aid networks. A movement culture that feels like community, not a career ladder, will retain passionate organizers and build resilient social fabric. Finally, the environmental movement must return to membership-based organizing that creates genuine grassroots accountability. This means building organizations accountable to their members, measuring success by mobilization capacity, and prioritizing grassroots power building over insider access. This roots insider tactics in genuine grassroots strength. The environmental movement holds the potential to become one of the most powerful engines of social transformation. The ecological crisis will expose our shared vulnerability, cutting across race, class, and politics. Defending nature is a moral imperative, bound to our health, communities, children's future, and justice across generations. Solutions offer more than survival. They offer a blueprint for a more equitable, resilient, and life-affirming world. To fulfill its promise, the environmental movement must undergo a profound reawakening, a radical reorientation reclaiming its anti-establishment roots and confronting Pogo's warning, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." The enemy is embedded in how we live, the systems we sustain, and the comforts we normalize. The movement must transcend its fractures and forge unified structures for mass mobilization. It must once again become a moral force, speaking to the soul, crafting narratives that stir conviction, not resignation. Our messaging must elevate courage above fear, offering not just diagnosis but a vision of possibility. The future is not yet written. The road ahead is uncertain, but the horizon remains open. Whether the environmental movement rises to meet this moment will determine not only the fate of natural systems, but also the future of democratic resistance and collective agency. The stakes could not be higher. Trump's campaign threatens more than environment. It strikes at democratic governance. If the movement fails to summon mass resistance, it falls short not only in protecting the planet, but in upholding democratic ideals. The choice is stark. The environmental movement can continue fragmented and marginalized, or it can reclaim its soul, rebuild its foundations, and rise as a force for transformative change. Upon this decision rests not only environmental protection, but perhaps the fate of democratic institutions. The time for choosing is now.